November 1967, Hoboken, New Jersey. The autumn wind swept through the narrow streets of the waterfront city that had produced one of the most famous voices in American history, carrying with it the smell of the Hudson River and the promise of a winter that would arrive sooner than anyone who had not grown up in this corner of New Jersey could appreciate. A 73-year-old man walked slowly along Washington Street, his arms burdened with grocery bags that seemed too heavy for someone of his age and condition to be carrying without assistance. Anthony Martin Sinatra, known to everyone in the neighborhood as Marty, had lived in Hoboken his entire life, except for the brief period when his son's success had allowed the family to relocate to more comfortable surroundings in Fort Lee. But Hoboken remained his spiritual home, the place where he had worked as a firefighter for decades, where he had raised the boy who became Frank, and where he still maintained connections that wealth and fame could never replace with anything of comparable value. The grocery bags contained the ingredients for a dinner that Dolly wanted to prepare, items that Marty had been dispatched to purchase from the Italian market on First Street, where the family had been buying provisions since before Frank was born. The walk was longer than it had once seemed, his legs no longer possessing the strength that had carried him through burning buildings during his years with the fire department. But he had refused Dolly's suggestion that he take a taxi because walking these streets was one of the few pleasures that age had not yet stolen from him. The bags grew heavier with each block, the handles cutting into his fingers with a pressure that would leave marks he would notice later, when the numbness subsided. He paused at the corner of 4th Street to catch his breath, leaning against a lamppost while shifting the weight from one arm to the other, in a futile attempt to find a configuration that did not cause pain. He did not notice the young woman who had been walking behind him until she appeared at his side, her face showing concern that seemed genuine rather than the performative politeness that strangers sometimes displayed when they encountered elderly people struggling with tasks that had once been effortless. She asked if she could help, reaching for the bags before he could respond, with the automatic refusal that pride demanded from men of his generation. Her name was Rosa Maria Esperanza, a 24-year-old nursing student at St. Mary Hospital who had been walking home from a clinical rotation when she noticed the old man struggling with his groceries. She had grown up in a family where helping others was not a choice but an obligation, where the elderly were respected, regardless of their circumstances, and where refusing assistance when it was clearly needed was considered a form of cruelty that could not be justified by appeals to independence or self-reliance. Marty protested that he was fine, that he had carried heavier loads during his years as a firefighter, that he did not need help from a young woman who surely had more important things to do than assist an old man with his shopping. But Rosa had already taken one of the bags from his hands, her grip firm enough to make clear that she was not asking permission, but rather informing him of what was about to happen, regardless of his objections. She asked where he was going, and he told her the address on Garden Street where he and Dolly had lived for years, a modest home that bore no indication of the wealth their son had accumulated or the fame that attached to the Sinatra name throughout the world. The house was approximately 6 blocks away, a distance that Marty had been dreading as the weight of the bags increased with each step he took. Rosa walked beside him, carrying the heavier of the 2 bags, while engaging him in conversation that distracted from the physical discomfort of the journey. She asked about his life in Hoboken, about the changes he had witnessed during his decades in the city, about the family he must have raised in a neighborhood where children once played in streets that were now dominated by automobiles. Marty found himself talking more freely than he usually did with strangers, something about the young woman's manner putting him at ease in a way that his natural reticence would normally have prevented. He told her about his years with the fire department, about the cause that still haunted his dreams decades after he had hung up his helmet, about the brotherhood of men who ran toward danger when everyone else was running away. He did not mention his son's name, partly because he had learned that doing so changed the nature of every conversation, and partly because he wanted to know whether this young woman's kindness was genuine rather than motivated by the hope of connection to celebrity. The test was not conscious, but it shaped his choices about what to share and what to withhold during the walk that was transforming from obligation into unexpected pleasure. Rosa listened with the attention of someone who understood that elderly people possessed stories worth hearing, that the years they had accumulated contained wisdom that younger generations too often ignored in their rush toward futures that would eventually bring them to the same place of reflection that Marty now occupied. Her questions were thoughtful, drawing out details that he had not intended to share, but that emerged naturally from a conversation that felt more like friendship than charity. The blocks passed more quickly than Marty had anticipated, the distraction of conversation shortening a journey that had seemed interminable when he contemplated it alone with his heavy bags. Rosa's presence transformed the walk from a burden to be endured into an experience to be enjoyed, a gift that she was giving without any awareness of its value to a man who spent too many hours alone with memories that grew heavier each year. They arrived at the house on Garden Street, a modest structure that Marty had purchased decades earlier, with savings accumulated through years of municipal employment and careful financial management. The neighborhood had changed around it. Some houses improved by owners who had prospered, while others had declined as families moved away, and renters replaced the long-time residents who had given the street its character. Rosa helped carry the bags to the front door, where Dolly appeared with an expression that combined gratitude for the assistance with curiosity about the young woman who had provided it. Marty introduced Rosa as someone who had helped him with his groceries, a description that failed to capture the significance of the encounter, but that was sufficient for the moment. Dolly invited Rosa inside for coffee, an offer that the young woman initially declined because she did not want to impose, but that she eventually accepted because Dolly's insistence made clear that refusal would be the greater imposition. The kitchen where they sat was modest but immaculate, a space that reflected Dolly's standards for cleanliness that bordered on obsession. Before continuing with this investigation, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in that kitchen in Hoboken in November 1967 involves one of the most remarkable acts of kindness in entertainment history. A nursing student who helped a stranger with his groceries, and the way Frank Sinatra learned about her generosity and responded in ways that transformed her life forever. By the end of this story, you will understand why the voice never forgot the woman who treated his father with dignity when she had no idea who he was. Rosa Maria Esperanza had been born on March 17, 1943, in San Juan, Puerto Rico, the youngest of 7 children in a family that had struggled with poverty that made American deprivation seem almost comfortable by comparison. Her father had worked in the sugarcane fields until his health failed. Her mother had taken in laundry and sewing to supplement income that was never sufficient, and the children had learned from infancy that survival required sacrifice and cooperation. The family emigrated to New York when Rosa was 12, joining relatives who had established themselves in the Bronx during the Great Puerto Rican Migration that transformed neighborhoods throughout the metropolitan area. Her father found work in a factory, her mother cleaned offices at night, and the children attended schools where they faced discrimination that taught them resilience, while also teaching them the importance of proving through achievement that prejudice was based on ignorance rather than fact. Rosa had decided to become a nurse after watching helplessly as her grandmother died from a condition that proper medical care might have prevented, a loss that channeled her grief into determination to acquire skills that would allow her to help others avoid similar tragedies. She had worked her way through nursing school, supporting herself through jobs that left little time for sleep or social life, but that brought her closer each semester to the credentials that would transform her from someone who wanted to help into someone who could. The clinical rotation at St. Mary Hospital in Hoboken had been assigned randomly, placing her in a community she had never previously visited, but that immediately felt familiar because of its working-class character and immigrant heritage that reminded her of her own neighborhood in the Bronx. The patients she encountered were not wealthy or powerful, but they possessed a dignity that she recognized and respected. The conversation in the Sinatra kitchen extended far beyond the time required to drink a single cup of coffee. Dolly's natural sociability, drawing Rosa into discussions that ranged from her nursing studies to her family's journey from Puerto Rico to the challenges she faced as a Latina woman in a profession dominated by white Americans who sometimes questioned whether she belonged. Marty listened quietly while the women talked, contributing occasionally but mostly observing the young woman who had helped him without knowing who he was or expecting anything in return. He noticed her intelligence, her compassion, her determination to improve her circumstances through education rather than waiting for opportunities that might never arrive. Dolly eventually mentioned that they had a son, a comment that she delivered casually, as if having a famous child was unremarkable and unworthy of elaboration. Rosa nodded politely, assuming that the son was probably a local businessman or perhaps a professional whose success had allowed his parents to retire comfortably in the neighborhood where they had spent their lives. The photograph on the wall should have revealed the truth. A framed image of Frank Sinatra that hung alongside other family pictures in a display that documented decades of milestones and celebrations. But Rosa had not looked closely at the photographs. Her attention focused on the people in front of her rather than the images surrounding them. She left the Sinatra home with an invitation to return whenever she was in the neighborhood, an offer that Dolly extended with warmth that suggested it was genuine rather than merely polite. Rosa promised to visit again if her clinical schedule permitted, a promise she intended to keep because the encounter had been pleasant and because she sensed that the elderly couple might benefit from companionship that their circumstances otherwise lacked. The weeks that followed included additional visits that became increasingly regular as Rosa discovered that her rotation schedule allowed time for brief stops at the house on Garden Street. She brought groceries occasionally, helped with small tasks that had become difficult for Marty's aging body, and sat with Dolly over coffee that seemed to taste better in that modest kitchen than anywhere else she'd experienced. The friendship developed naturally, unburdened by the complications that would have accompanied knowledge of the family's famous connection. Rosa treated Marty and Dolly as ordinary people, because that was what she believed them to be. Elderly immigrants whose lives had been shaped by the same forces that had shaped her own family's experience in America. Marty grew to look forward to Rosa's visits with an anticipation that he mentioned to Dolly but concealed from Rosa herself, not wanting the young woman to feel obligated to continue a friendship that had begun accidentally and that should be allowed to continue only if it remained genuinely mutual. His pride, which had initially resisted her help with the groceries, now expressed itself through a determination not to become a burden on someone whose kindness he valued too much to exploit. The truth about the family's identity emerged accidentally in December, when Rosa arrived for a visit and found the house decorated for Christmas in a manner that included photographs of Frank Sinatra that were too prominently displayed and too professionally produced to be anything other than publicity materials. She stopped in the doorway, her eyes moving from the photographs to Marty's face as connections formed that had been invisible until that moment. Dolly noticed Rosa's expression and understood immediately what had happened. She explained matter-of-factly that Frank was their son, that his success had been a blessing for the family, and that his absence from recent conversations was not intended as deception, but simply reflected their preference for relationships that existed independent of his fame. Rosa's reaction was not what Marty had feared during the weeks when he had wondered whether revealing the truth would transform a genuine friendship into something complicated by celebrity. She expressed surprise, but not the calculating interest that so many people displayed when they learned of connections to the famous. Instead, she seemed almost embarrassed, as if she had intruded on private territory that she had not known she was entering. She asked if her continued visits were appropriate, given what she now knew, whether the friendship they had developed should be reconsidered in light of information that changed the context of everything that had occurred since she first helped an old man carry his groceries along Washington Street. Marty responded with an emotion that surprised him, telling Rosa that her visits had been among the greatest pleasures of his recent months and that he hoped the revelation of his son's identity would not cause her to withdraw from a friendship that he had come to value more than he could easily express. The words were more direct than his normal reserve permitted, but the occasion seemed to require directness. Frank learned about Rosa during a phone call with his mother in late December, Dolly mentioning the young nursing student who had been visiting regularly and who had become something of a companion for Marty during afternoons when Dolly was occupied with other activities. The description intrigued Frank, who understood from experience how rarely people treated his parents as individuals rather than as paths to access and influence. He asked his mother to describe Rosa's help without revealing what she knew about the family. wanting to understand whether her kindness had been genuine or whether subtle signs might indicate that she had known from the beginning who Marty was and had calculated her assistance accordingly. Dolly assured him that Rosa's surprise upon learning the truth had been authentic, that no one could have faked the embarrassment she had displayed. The decision to meet Rosa was made during Frank's next visit to Hoboken, a trip scheduled for early January 1968 that would allow him to see his parents and to evaluate personally the young woman whose kindness had impressed them so deeply. He instructed Dolly to invite Rosa for dinner on an evening when he would be present, an arrangement that would allow him to observe her without the artificial dynamics that formal introductions to celebrities typically created. Rosa arrived at the Sinatra home on the appointed evening, expecting an ordinary dinner with Marty and Dolly, perhaps with other family members who might be visiting during the holiday season. She had dressed nicely but not elaborately, her nursing student budget limiting options that might have been available to someone with more resources. The door opened to reveal Frank Sinatra standing in the entrance hall of his parents' home, his famous face wearing an expression of welcome that seemed genuine rather than performative. Rosa froze, her mind struggling to reconcile the ordinary expectations of the evening with the extraordinary reality of who was greeting her as if she were an expected and valued guest. Frank extended his hand and thanked her for the kindness she had shown his parents, particularly his father, whose pride made asking for help almost impossible, and whose gratitude for her assistance had been expressed repeatedly during conversations that Frank had monitored through his regular phone calls. The words were simple, but carried a weight that communicated how much her actions had meant to a family that was accustomed to people wanting something rather than simply offering. The dinner that followed was unlike anything Rosa had experienced, not because of its elaborateness, which was modest by the standards that Sinatra's wealth could have commanded, but because of the naturalness with which she was included in conversation that ranged across topics she had discussed with Marty and Dolly during her previous visits, as well as new subjects that Frank's presence introduced. He asked about her nursing studies, her career aspirations, her family's journey from Puerto Rico to New York, her experiences with discrimination that his own Italian immigrant parents had faced in earlier decades, when prejudice against their community had been as virulent as what Latinos now encountered. The questions were intelligent and respectful, demonstrating an interest that seemed genuine rather than obligatory. Rosa found herself relaxing, despite the surreal circumstances of dining with one of the most famous entertainers in the world, as if such occasions were ordinary rather than impossible for someone of her background and circumstances. Frank's manner put her at ease in ways that his fame should have prevented. A skill that she would later learn was one of his most valuable attributes when he chose to deploy it. After dinner, when coffee had been served and conversation had wound down to the comfortable silence of people who have said what needed to be said, Frank asked Rosa what her plans were after completing her nursing degree. The question seemed casual, but carried an undertone that suggested he was evaluating options that he had not yet revealed. She described her hope of working in a hospital where she could specialize in pediatric care, her particular interest in serving communities like her own, where access to quality healthcare was limited by economic circumstances and geographic isolation. The answer reflected values that Frank recognized from his own family's experience, a commitment to helping others that was not merely professional, but deeply personal. The offer he made changed her life in ways she could not have anticipated when she stopped to help an old man with his groceries 2 months earlier. He would pay for the remainder of her nursing education, would provide a monthly stipend that would allow her to focus on her studies without the distracting necessity of working additional jobs to cover expenses, and would help her secure a position at a hospital that aligned with her goals after she completed her degree. Rosa's initial response was refusal, her pride and her principles making it impossible to accept charity from someone whose connection to her was based on nothing more than a chance encounter and a few kindnesses that any decent person would have offered. The offer seemed disproportionate to what she had done, an imbalance that made her uncomfortable, even as she recognized the opportunities it represented. Frank anticipated this reaction and countered with an argument that proved difficult to resist. He told her that he had spent years being approached by people who wanted things from him, who calculated their interactions with him based on what they might gain, who treated him as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be known. Her treatment of his father had been different, genuine in a way that he rarely experienced, and the offer he was making was not charity, but rather payment for something valuable that she had provided without expectation of compensation. He framed the assistance as an investment in someone who would use it to help others, a multiplication of good that would extend far beyond the immediate benefit to Rosa herself. The money he would spend was trivial compared to his resources, but significant compared to the impact it would have on her career and on the communities she would eventually serve. The conversation continued for hours as Rosa wrestled with an offer that challenged her understanding of how the world worked and what she deserved to receive from it. Marty and Dolly supported Frank's proposal, sharing their own perspective on a young woman whose character they had observed over months of friendship and whose potential they believed was worth nurturing. Rosa eventually accepted, her resistance overcome not by the financial arguments, but by Marty's quiet statement that she had given him something precious during their walks and conversations, something that money could not buy, but that deserved recognition nonetheless. The old man's words carried a weight that Frank's could not, the authority of someone whose approval Rosa had come to value during their friendship. The scholarship that Frank established covered not only the remainder of Rosa's nursing degree, but also the advanced training that would qualify her for the specialized pediatric work she hoped to pursue. The monthly stipend was generous enough to eliminate financial stress, while modest enough to avoid the complications that excessive wealth might have created for someone whose values were rooted in modesty. Her graduation from St. Mary Hospital's nursing program in 1969 was attended by both Sinatra parents, Marty and Dolly sitting in the audience with the pride of surrogate grandparents, watching a member of their extended family achieve a milestone they had helped make possible. Frank did not attend, understanding that his presence would transform the ceremony into something about him rather than about Rosa. The position she secured at a children's hospital in the Bronx fulfilled the aspirations she had described during that dinner conversation, placing her in a community where her skills and her cultural understanding could make a difference in lives that were often overlooked by a healthcare system that served wealth more attentively than it served need. Marty Sinatra died on January 24, 1969, just weeks after watching Rosa graduate, his final months enriched by a friendship that had begun with groceries and ended with something approaching family. Rosa attended his funeral, sitting with Dolly and other close friends rather than with the celebrities whose presence dominated media coverage of the event. Frank acknowledged Rosa during the private reception following the funeral, thanking her again for the kindness she had shown his father and expressing gratitude that Marty's final year had included a friendship that had brought him genuine joy during a period when his declining health might otherwise have isolated him in sadness. The relationship between Rosa and the Sinatra family continued after Marty's death, Dolly maintaining contact through phone calls and occasional visits that sustained a connection Rosa valued for its own sake rather than for any reflected glory it might have provided. The friendship was genuine, rooted in experiences that had occurred before Rosa knew who the Sinatras were, and that retained their authenticity despite subsequent revelations. Rosa's career in pediatric nursing extended over 4 decades, her skills and her compassion touching thousands of children whose lives were improved by care she provided with the dedication she had promised during that dinner conversation with Frank Sinatra. She never forgot the origin of the opportunities that had made her career possible, the chance encounter on Washington Street that had connected her to a family whose generosity had transformed her life. The story of how she met the Sinatras became part of her teaching when she eventually transitioned from clinical practice to nursing education, an example she used to illustrate the importance of treating every patient and every person with dignity, regardless of their apparent circumstances. She would tell students that you never knew who you might be helping, or what consequences might flow from simple acts of kindness. Dolly Sinatra died in a plane crash on January 6, 1977, a tragedy that devastated Frank and that Rosa learned about through news reports that failed to capture the human being she had known during years of friendship. She attended memorial services that Frank organized, paying respects to a woman whose invitation to coffee had begun a relationship that enriched Rosa's life in ways that transcended the financial assistance she had received. Frank Sinatra himself maintained sporadic contact with Rosa throughout the following decades, phone calls and occasional letters that acknowledged a connection that both valued even as their lives followed paths that rarely intersected geographically. He inquired about her work, her family, her satisfaction with the career that his support had helped make possible. The children Rosa eventually raised learned the story of how their mother met Frank Sinatra's father, a tale that seemed incredible until they understood that their mother's character was exactly the kind that would stop to help an elderly stranger with heavy bags regardless of whether cameras were watching or rewards might follow. The story confirmed what they already knew about who she was. Rosa's retirement from nursing came in 2008, after 40 years of service that had earned her recognition from professional organizations and gratitude from countless families whose children had received her care. The career that had begun with Sinatra's support ended with achievements that validated his investment in someone whose character he had recognized during a single dinner conversation. She maintained connections to the Sinatra legacy through correspondence with family members who remembered her kindness to Marty and through occasional participation in events that honored Frank's philanthropic activities. Her story was sometimes shared at these events as an example of the unexpected ways that generosity could manifest and the lasting impact that recognition of kindness could create. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998, and Rosa mourned a man she had known briefly, but whose impact on her life had been profound and lasting. She attended memorial events in New York, sharing space with celebrities and dignitaries who had known a different Frank than the one who had sat with her in his parents' modest kitchen discussing her dreams for a nursing career. The hospital where Rosa had spent most of her career established a scholarship in her name after her retirement, funding the education of nursing students from backgrounds similar to her own, who might otherwise struggle to afford the training necessary for careers in healthcare. The scholarship continued the pattern of investment in potential that Frank Sinatra had initiated when he offered to pay for her education. Rosa Maria Esperanza died on February 3, 2020, at the age of 76, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and colleagues who represented the various chapters of a life that had been transformed by a chance encounter on a Hoboken street corner. Her obituary mentioned her connection to the Sinatra family, but those who knew her understood that the connection was significant, not because of the fame it involved, but because of what it revealed about character that expressed itself through kindness, regardless of who might be watching. The story of the nursing student who helped Frank Sinatra's father carry groceries has been told and retold in the decades since it occurred, sometimes with embellishments that add drama, but that obscure the essential simplicity of what happened. A young woman saw an old man struggling and offered to help, expecting nothing in return, but receiving more than she could have imagined, because the old man's son believed that genuine kindness deserved recognition and reward. The lesson that emerges from this story is not about the importance of helping famous people's relatives in hopes of receiving benefits, a calculation that would corrupt the very quality that made Rosa's assistance valuable. The lesson is about character that expresses itself consistently regardless of circumstances, kindness that flows from values so deeply held that they require no thought or calculation. Marty Sinatra was simply an old man carrying heavy groceries when Rosa stopped to help him, and her assistance was given to that old man rather than to the father of a celebrity whose favor might prove useful. The purity of her motivation was precisely what made it worthy of the recognition it eventually received, a paradox that demonstrates how genuine virtue operates differently from strategic kindness. The modest house on Garden Street in Hoboken no longer belongs to the Sinatra family. Its connection to one of America's most famous entertainers, marked only by a plaque that tourists occasionally photograph without understanding the full history of what occurred there. The kitchen where Rosa sat with Dolly drinking coffee has been renovated beyond recognition, its original character preserved only in memories that fade with each passing year. But the impact of what happened there continues to ripple outward through time, touching lives that have no direct connection to Rosa or the Sinatras, but that benefit nonetheless from the example they set about how kindness can create chains of consequence that extend far beyond their origins. The nursing students whose education is funded by the scholarship in Rosa's name are links in a chain that began when she stopped to help a stranger. The clinical practice that Rosa developed over her decades of nursing incorporated lessons she had learned from the Sinatra family about the importance of treating every person with dignity, regardless of their apparent status or circumstances. She approached wealthy patients and poor patients with identical attention, understanding that illness was a great equalizer that stripped away the superficial distinctions that society used to sort people into categories of greater or lesser worth. Her colleagues observed this quality and learned from her example, absorbing lessons about professional conduct that textbooks could not teach, but that observation of excellence in practice could demonstrate. The nurses she trained carried her values into their own careers, extending her influence far beyond the patients she personally served. The children's ward, where Rosa spent most of her career, became known for the quality of care it provided, a reputation that attracted families from across the metropolitan area who sought treatment that combined technical competence with genuine compassion. The atmosphere she helped create was palpable to anyone who entered the ward, a sense that the patients mattered as individuals rather than merely as cases to be processed. The relationship between nursing education and clinical practice that Rosa embodied became a model for how healthcare institutions could bridge the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom. She served on committees that redesigned curricula, contributed to publications that shared best practices, and mentored countless students who benefited from her experience and her willingness to share what she had learned. The Hispanic community in the Bronx recognized Rosa as one of their own who had achieved success without abandoning the values and connections that rooted her in the neighborhood where she had grown up. She remained accessible to young people seeking advice about healthcare careers, providing guidance that reflected both professional expertise and personal understanding of the challenges they faced. Her involvement in community health initiatives extended beyond her hospital duties, volunteer work that addressed needs she encountered among families whose circumstances prevented them from accessing the care that more affluent communities took for granted. She organized vaccination drives, conducted health education sessions, and advocated for resources that would improve outcomes for populations that official statistics often overlooked. The influence of Frank Sinatra's support extended beyond the immediate financial assistance to include connections that opened doors which might otherwise have remained closed to a Puerto Rican nursing student from the Bronx. His endorsement carried weight with administrators who controlled hiring decisions and with philanthropists who funded programs that Rosa eventually led. She never traded on this connection explicitly, preferring to let her work speak for itself, rather than relying on famous associations that might undermine the professional credibility she had earned through years of dedication. But those who knew her story understood that the opportunities she received had origins in a chance encounter that most people would have passed by without stopping. The documentation of Rosa's relationship with the Sinatra family was preserved in letters and photographs that her children discovered after her death, a private archive that revealed the depth of connection that had developed from such unlikely beginnings. The correspondence showed Frank's ongoing interest in her career and his pride in achievements that validated the investment he had made in someone whose character he had recognized during a single evening's conversation. The photographs captured moments from visits and events that spanned decades, images of Rosa with various members of the Sinatra family that documented a relationship unusual, both for its origins and for its persistence across years when the original participants aged and circumstances changed. These photographs now belong to her grandchildren, family heirlooms that connect them to a history larger than their own experience. The scholarship fund that Rosa established in her final years was endowed with savings she had accumulated over a career that paid modestly by American standards, but generously by the standards of her childhood in Puerto Rico. She wanted to replicate for others the opportunity that Frank Sinatra had provided for her, to continue a chain of generosity that she hoped would extend indefinitely into the future. The selection criteria for the scholarship emphasized character as much as academic achievement, seeking students who demonstrated the qualities that Rosa had displayed when she stopped to help a stranger with his groceries without any expectation of reward. The applications were reviewed by committees that looked for evidence of genuine kindness rather than strategic virtue that aimed at recognition. The hospital where Rosa worked eventually named a wing in her honor. Recognition that came after her retirement and that acknowledged not only her professional contributions, but also the spirit she had brought to an institution that benefited from her presence for 4 decades. The naming ceremony included remarks about her connection to the Sinatra family, details that surprised many colleagues who had not known the full story of how her career had been made possible. Frank Sinatra's philanthropy during his lifetime included many recipients whose stories were never publicly known, beneficiaries of generosity that he preferred to keep private because publicity would have transformed acts of kindness into public relations and undermined the purity of intention that he valued. Rosa's story became known only because she chose to share it in her later years as an example for nursing students who might benefit from understanding that kindness could have consequences they could not predict. The decision to share the story was not motivated by any desire for personal recognition, but rather by Rosa's belief that younger generations needed examples of how character could be recognized and rewarded in a world that sometimes seemed to value calculation over virtue. She wanted students to understand that helping others was worthwhile regardless of whether rewards followed, while also acknowledging that rewards sometimes did follow in ways that could not be anticipated. Her children absorbed these lessons throughout their upbringing, learning from their mother's example that treating people with dignity was not merely morally correct, but also practically wise because you never knew who you might be helping or what connections might exist beneath surfaces that revealed nothing of the depths they concealed. The lesson was reinforced by the family's unique history, evidence that kindness had indeed been rewarded in their mother's life. The grandchildren who gathered around Rosa in her final years inherited stories that connected them to entertainment history while also teaching them about values that transcended celebrity. They understood that their grandmother's significance was not derived from her association with the Sinatra family, but rather that the association itself resulted from qualities she possessed independent of any famous connection. The nursing profession that Rosa served throughout her career has been transformed by technologies and organizational changes that would have seemed impossible during the years when she trained at St. Mary Hospital in Hoboken. But the fundamental importance of compassionate care that she embodied remains constant regardless of how medical practice evolves. Her colleagues who gathered for her memorial service shared stories that illustrated the consistency of her character across decades. The way she treated patients and families with respect that never wavered regardless of the pressures and frustrations that healthcare workers routinely encountered. The stories confirmed that the kindness she had shown Marty Sinatra was not an isolated incident, but rather an expression of who she fundamentally was. The connection between Rosa's story and broader themes in American immigration history provides context for understanding why her encounter with the Sinatra family resonated beyond its immediate participants. Both families had experienced the challenges of establishing themselves in a country that did not always welcome newcomers, and their recognition of each other reflected shared understanding of what it meant to build lives from difficult beginnings. The Italian immigrant experience that shaped the Sinatra family and the Puerto Rican immigrant experience that shaped Rosa's family had more in common than superficial differences might suggest. Both communities faced discrimination, both relied on mutual support to overcome obstacles, and both produced individuals whose achievements contributed to American culture in ways that enriched the nation that had initially regarded them with suspicion. Frank Sinatra's decision to support Rosa's education can be understood as recognition of shared heritage as much as reward for individual virtue, an acknowledgement that the young Puerto Rican woman reminded him of his own family's journey from poverty and prejudice towards success and acceptance. The investment he made was partly personal and partly representative of broader solidarity between immigrant communities. Rosa understood this dimension of their connection and incorporated it into how she explained the relationship to those who asked about her unlikely friendship with one of the most famous families in American entertainment. She emphasized that Sinatra had seen in her something familiar, something that connected their experiences despite the differences in their specific backgrounds. The documentation of immigrant contributions to American healthcare includes countless stories like Rosa's, individuals whose determination to serve others was shaped by experiences that mainstream Americans often overlooked or misunderstood. Her career represented not only personal achievement, but also the broader contributions of communities whose members staffed hospitals and clinics that served everyone regardless of background. The recognition she received late in her career acknowledged these broader contributions while also honoring the specific qualities that had distinguished her service from the beginning. The naming of a hospital wing, the establishment of scholarships, and the tributes from professional organizations reflected appreciation that extended beyond gratitude for competent service to recognition of exemplary character. Her story has been shared in nursing education programs as an example of how professional excellence and personal virtue can reinforce each other, each strengthening the other in ways that create careers characterized by both technical achievement and human connection. Students who hear the story learn that the qualities that made Rosa exceptional were not separate from her professional skills, but were rather integrated with them in ways that enhanced everything she did. The Hoboken neighborhood where Rosa first encountered Marty Sinatra has gentrified beyond recognition in the decades since their meeting, the working-class character that defined it during the 1960s, replaced by affluence that would have astonished the immigrants who built their lives there during earlier generations. The changes are neither entirely positive nor entirely negative, but they are profound. The transformation of Hoboken into a bedroom community for Manhattan professionals has erased much of the physical environment where the Sinatra family lived and where Rosa's encounter with Marty occurred. The grocery store on First Street, where he purchased the items she helped him carry, no longer exists, replaced by establishments that serve demographics whose preferences differ dramatically from those of previous generations. But the human connections that were formed in the old Hoboken survive in memories and stories that are passed down through families who remember what the community was like before prosperity transformed it. Rosa's story is part of this collective memory, evidence of relationships that transcended the boundaries that divided the neighborhood into ethnic enclaves, while also connecting it to worlds beyond its immediate geography. The persistence of her story demonstrates the power of narrative to preserve what physical changes have erased, to maintain connections to the past that would otherwise be lost as witnesses die and locations are demolished. The telling and retelling of how a nursing student helped Frank Sinatra's father keeps alive a version of Hoboken and a version of human possibility that contemporary observers might otherwise find difficult to imagine. Rest in peace, Rosa Maria Esperanza. Your hands carried more than groceries when you helped an old man on a Hoboken street corner, demonstrating a kindness that revealed character worthy of recognition and reward. And rest in peace, Anthony Martin Sinatra and Natalie Dolly Sinatra, parents who raised a son famous for his voice, but who possessed their own gifts of generosity that expressed themselves through the young woman they welcomed into their home. And rest in peace, Francis Albert Sinatra, who understood that genuine kindness was rare enough to deserve celebration, and who used his resources to ensure that virtue did not go unrewarded, even when virtue itself expected nothing in return.